Thank you, Larry. Please let me know if you can't hear me, and I will be a little more careful with microphone placement if it comes to that. I'm James Lewis. I've been teaching at Kalamazoo College since the early part of 2003. Before that, I had taught at Louisiana State University, Penn briefly, University of Virginia briefly, Kalamazoo College, Wichita Hollins University briefly. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I've written a number of books on a period mostly a little bit after this, but they're all grounded in what I'm going to talk to you about tonight as well. So this is something that I've been doing for a while. All right. What do we mean by original intent? Well, you generally hear this phrase regarding matters of constitutional interpretation. A lawyer or a judge or a Supreme Court justice will justify his or her position on a piece of legislation or an act of government by insisting that that position is consistent with the original intent of the Constitution and is therefore correct. The phrase entered general usage really in the 1980s. Attorney General Nice, President Ronald Reagan used it a good bit. This was a conservative response to a Supreme Court that in the 50s and 60s had issued a number of liberal decisions, such as Brown versus Board of Education, based as much on the findings of social scientists as on the language of the Constitution. At least that's how it seemed to some people. But the underlying concept that in exercising the various powers of the federal government, the correct meaning of the different sections of the Constitution had to be properly understood. That was present really from its very beginnings in 1789. In fact, one of the first things that Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton disagreed about was the proper interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson and his supporters insisted on a strict construction, very tight reading of what the Constitution granted in terms of powers. Hamilton and his supporters embraced a loose construction that relied very heavily on the vagueness of the necessary and proper clause and the general welfare clause. Viewed as a standard for constitutional interpretation, original intent is inherently problematic. Whose original intent matters, we might ask? Is it that of the actual author or authors of the relevant section of the Constitution? Or that of the 39 men who signed the Constitution in September 1787? Or that of the 55 men who attended the convention, 16 of whom left or refused to sign before September? Or is it that of the hundreds of men who wrote on behalf of the Constitution in newspapers and pamphlets during the ratification process? Or is it even that of the state ratifying conventions themselves, the debates going on in the 13 states? That final position, I think we would say, sounds extreme. Then we have to look at what was going on in the 13 states. But in fact, that is exactly what James Madison, who is often called the father of the Constitution, said it should be the standard for interpretation. He wrote, quote, "We must look for the meaning of the instrument not in the General Convention, which proposed, but in the state conventions which accepted and ratified the Constitution." Do we even have the sources that we would need to arrive at such an original intent? Many of the state conventions were poorly recorded at best. Some of them left almost no records whatsoever. But even for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the best record, Madison's own notes, is obviously incomplete. Modern scholars suggest that he took down somewhere between a quarter and a fifth, but maybe even less than that, of what was said. Adopting original intent as our standard of interpretation also raises the question, how confident can we be that we properly understand whomever's original intent we decide to privilege? Before the Constitution was 4 decades old, Madison lamented that the meaning of some of its words had changed so much that it was already, in his terms, undergoing interpretations unknown to its founders. So after 4 decades, we're closing in on 250 years. What's most striking to me, however, about contemporary disputes over original intent over the last 40 years or so is, what's most striking to me about contemporary whether original intent should be used as a standard and how we should determine it if it is our standard is how far the concerns of modern originalists in the Supreme Court and elsewhere are from the most important intentions of the framers of the Constitution. And that's what I really want to focus on tonight. What did the people who were involved in framing and ratifying the Constitution see as its purposes? What were their intentions with the document? And I think we'll find that they're, in fact, very different from the modern usage of that term. I think we'll also see how alien their concerns are from our own, how difficult it is for us to appreciate their fears, the fears that most strongly motivated them, and how easy it has been for Americans, and honestly beginning within a couple of decades of the Constitutional Convention, to forget the framers' actual intents. This is not something we've screwed up in the last 50, 60, 100 years. This is something that was being lost by the 1820s. So, how do we know what the framers of the Constitution wanted it to accomplish? Well, on this issue, the evidence is abundant. It is in the private letters, the published essays, the speeches, and the other writings of the men, and they were all men as far as we know, who prepared, signed, and publicly advocated the new Constitution in the late 1780s. The men who called themselves Federalists and labeled their opponents anti-Federalists at the time of the ratification debates. It is also in the preamble to the Constitution itself. Oops, that's not the one I wanted to show you. Which says that it has been, quote, ordained and established by the people to, quote, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Right? I could have sung it in the Schoolhouse Rock thing, but you're probably hearing that in your own ears. So. In the minds of the framers, it was the first of these, forming a more perfect union, that was essential to achieving the other 5, justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, and liberty. Now, there already had been a union among the 13 North American states that had recently won their independence from Great Britain, but it looked, to most observers in the late 1780s, far from perfect. In fact, it appeared to be on the verge of total collapse. Union had seemed essential when the states or colonies embarked on their quest for independence in the summer of 1776, but it had grown increasingly strained over time. The Articles of Confederation, the original governing document for the United States, had created what was basically an alliance of essentially sovereign states rather than a coherent nation. Even at the best of times, in other words, even at the very worst of times, in terms of the Revolutionary War, when union was most critical, the Confederation government had struggled to get the states to provide it with men, materiel, and money. As the need for union decreased, with the surrender of General Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781, and the signing of the peace treaty in Paris in January 1783, the friction between the states and the Confederation government over their respective powers, their respective limitations, only grew. By the mid-1780s, more and more people looked upon the general government, and this is their word, as an imbecile. It was incapable of doing the things, the basic things that governments are supposed to do. And it was in this situation largely because the state governments denied it the resources and the authority to do what the Articles of Confederation said it should be able to do. Even more worrisome than the tensions between the states and the general government were the tensions between the states themselves. The states had resumed some of their pre-war squabbles with each other over everything from boundary lines to commercial policies. Maryland clashed with Virginia over trade issues, over the Trans-Appalachian West, and over the use of the Potomac River, which they shared. Well, they didn't share it, that was the problem, because the king, a long, long time ago, had given the entire river to Maryland, and Virginia was not happy about that. Virginians still aren't happy about that. By the way, I've lived there plenty of time, and they're still not crazy about that. Connecticut nearly went to war with Pennsylvania over conflicting land claims in northeastern Pennsylvania around Wilkes-Barre, what was known as the Wyoming Valley. And New York did go to war with Vermont. Vermont had declared its independence from both New York and New Hampshire, which claimed it in 1777. Vermont certainly wanted to be a state. It wanted to be the 14th state. But New York would not allow that to happen because it did not want to lose its claims to the land. The Articles of Confederation gave Congress the authority and established the provisions for resolving most of these disputes anyway, and in some cases the prescribed methods brought about acceptable compromises. But how long would that continue to be the case? Particularly if the states continue to nibble away at the powers that have been allocated to the general government. Perhaps more alarmingly still, the whole of the West, everything beyond the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, seemed likely to separate from the Atlantic states and establish itself as a distinct nation or nations. North of the Ohio River, much of the Trans-Appalachian West had been transferred to the United States. You can see that, right? It's all in green. This is the Northwest Territory. I see this is deep into your bloodstream, right, the Northwest Territory, right? So that had all been transferred to the federal government, or the Confederation government. It was part of the national domain. South of the river, though, everything west of the mountains was claimed by one of the eastern states, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. There were not a lot of Americans living beyond the mountains at the end of the war, but a flood of settlers in the near future seemed very likely. And the ones who already lived there had shown themselves to be very anxious to achieve some measure of self-government. Those in the Kentucky District of Virginia, right, it's not a separate state at this point, it's a part of Virginia still, were hundreds of miles, difficult miles, over the mountain miles from their state capital in Richmond. They were already talking about some form of separation in the 1780s. In the mid-1780s, settlers in southwestern Virginia and northwestern North Carolina erected themselves into a new state, Franklin, right? New state of Franklin. They wanted to be a part of the United States as well. Tennessee did not want to give up the land. As George Washington warned in 1784, Westerners seemed likely to, quote, become a distinct people from us. Instead of adding to the strength of the Union, they will become a formidable and dangerous neighbor. Jefferson agreed, saying that unless the government could figure out how to meet their legitimate needs for defense, for trade, for self-government, Westerners would, quote, separate from our Confederacy and become its enemies. By the mid-1780s, many of the men who would ultimately shape and support the Constitution had decided that a crisis was imminent, if not already ongoing. In the summer of 1786, Washington insisted that, quote, things cannot go on in the same train forever. What seemed most likely to his mind was that, quote, the better kind of people, meaning the wealthy, being disgusted with the circumstances, will have their minds prepared for any revolution whatever. He worried, quote, we are apt to run from one extreme, an excess of democracy, into another, meaning a return to monarchy. Writing 6 months later, Madison agreed that the present system, quote, neither has nor deserves advocates. It could not, he thought, quote, last long under these circumstances. Madison already knew that the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was scheduled. He, in fact, knew that many of the states had chosen their delegates at it. But he predicted, quote, some very different arrangement than the current Confederation would come out of it. Like Washington, Madison saw evidence of growing support for monarchy among the elite, but he believed that, quote, the bulk of the people will probably prefer the lesser evil of a partition of the Union into three more practicable and energetic governments. But he insisted that while this union might be, quote, a lesser evil than monarchy, it is so great a one that I hope the danger of it will rouse all the real friends of the Revolution to exert themselves in favor of such an organization of the Confederacy as will perpetuate the Union and redeem the honor of the Republican name. The concerns of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and many, many others in the mid-1780s reflected not just their appraisal of the current situation at home, but also their understanding of the previous experiences of other nations. Through their reading of ancient and modern histories, European histories, the Federalists gained a better understanding of what was likely to happen. What was likely to happen first to their weak Confederacy, and then after its collapse, what was likely to happen to its constituent parts. Madison in particular studied and employed the histories of Europe's past confederacies. Before the Constitutional Convention, he prepared a lengthy document entitled Notes on Ancient and Modern Confederacies. This is just one page on the Lycian Confederacy. It was full of ammunition that he drew from the failed confederacies of ancient Greece and modern Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland that he could deploy against anyone in the convention in Philadelphia who tried to defend the current system. During the ratification battle, Madison joined Alexander Hamilton in writing 3 numbers of the famous Federalist essays that were devoted to exactly this issue. What had been the shortcomings of the Greek, the Dutch, and the German confederacies? What justified devoting so much time to these European confederacies, according to Publius was the pseudonym used by all 3 authors of the Federalist Papers, was the confidence that, quote, experience is the oracle of truth. But it wasn't merely the histories of Europe's failed confederacies that troubled Madison and other Federalists. The history of the continent as a whole held out alarming prospects in the minds of Americans who were increasingly convinced that their own continent would soon replicate Europe by becoming home to a multitude of independent nations of varied sizes, whether it was 13 or 14 or 15 separate states, or 3 or 4 partial confederacies. The lessons of Europe, which were so clear about the inherent weaknesses of confederacies, were no less clear in this regard. In Europe, wars had been nearly constant, as states fought with each other over land, trade, resources, and population. Small states, Europe's Connecticut's, Delaware's, and Rhode Island's, had repeatedly been swallowed up by their larger neighbors, Europe's Virginias, and Pennsylvanias, and New York's. States with limited or decentralized governments had been pulled apart or brought to heel by their more powerful neighbors. One of the great object lessons for American observers throughout the 1770s and 1780s was Poland. Poland had been a weak federation of limited powers, and over the course of those 2 decades, it was parceled out between its more powerful neighbors in a series of partitions until it ceased to exist altogether. Poland wasn't reconstituted until the aftermath of World War I. If the weak union of the Confederation broke apart into either 13 or 14 independent states, or probably 3 or 4 partial confederacies, each of the resulting governments would find itself in competition with its neighbors over territory and trade. Hamilton wrote in Federalist No. 6, it was, quote, a sort of axiom in politics that vicinity or nearness of situation constitutes nations' natural enemies. Such a situation, the Federalists believed, would mean the loss of all those things for which they had fought and sacrificed during the Revolutionary War. Most importantly, national independence, republican government, and popular liberty. It was easy for the founding generation to see how important the union of the states had been for winning independence, and it seemed clear that continued union would make it difficult, if not impossible, for a distant Spain, France, or Great Britain to destroy that independence. But preserving independence did not simply mean preventing recolonization by Great Britain or subjugation by another power. It also meant preserving freedom of action by remaining divorced from European politics and wars, and by retaining control for Americans over their own course. That sort of independence seems certain to be undermined by disunion. The inevitable imbalance of power in a divided North America would force the smaller states or confederacies to turn to Europe for allies to protect them from their larger neighbors. New England might look to Great Britain, the southern states to France, the West to Spain. The final result of this process, according to Madison, would be that the American states would, quote, be made subservient to the wars and politics of Europe. They might stay independent, but it would be independence in name only. They would have to abandon their freedom of action in order to protect their trade, territory, and citizens against their North American neighbors. Only a single union of the American states, it seemed, could preserve American independence in both of its meanings. Competition between North America's separate states, or partial confederacies, also seemed certain to destroy the Republican government and popular liberties in the states. The Federalists believed that these goals of the Revolution could not survive in the states if North America replicated Europe. Hamilton warned, quote, if we should be disunited, we should be, in a short course of time, in the predicament of the continental powers of Europe. Our liberties would be a prey to the means of defending ourselves against the ambition and jealousy of each other. According to this thinking, all of the states, large and small, had to be confident of their security. Why? Well, unless the states felt certain that disputes would be resolved peacefully, they would have the responsibility as sovereignties to take whatever steps were necessary to protect themselves. Self-preservation was understood as the most basic piece of the law of nations and the law of nature. They were obligated to preserve themselves. And threatened states would do that by raising large armies, erecting fortifications, paying for them with heavy taxes, developing stronger, more centralized governments. Now, we live with all of those things now and still generally believe that we have Republican government and popular liberty. But the founding generation considered such measures completely incompatible with their political principles. Necessary, if undesirable, in Europe's tyrannical governments, but utterly inappropriate for North America's liberty-loving republics. Only by combining the states into a single union, the Federalists argued, could Republican government and popular liberty be protected in each of them. Only then would the states be able to count on peace with their neighbors and surrender their sovereign responsibility for protecting their citizens through any means necessary. According to Hamilton, unless there was just a single government in North America, quote, we should, in a little time, see established in every part of this country the same engines of despotism which have been the scourge of the old world. What the Federalists insisted time and time again was that a divided North America could not escape the experiences of other continents, especially Europe. And to think otherwise was to ignore history, to idealize human nature, and to deceive oneself. Hamilton warned in Federalist 6 to look for a continuation of harmony between a number of independent, unconnected sovereignties situated in the same neighborhood would be to disregard the uniform course of human events and to set at defiance the accumulated experience of the ages. Anti-Federalists might argue, and some did, that North Americans' commercial republics would behave differently than Europe's empire-building monarchies. But according to Hamilton, such hopes were based on, quote, utopian speculations, on the deceitful dream of a golden age, of a happy empire, of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue. And in fact, Hamilton insisted that Americans were no different from any other people, and that to think otherwise was, quote, to forget that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. Washington likewise believed that, quote, we must take human nature as we find it. Perfection falls not to the share of mortals. And Madison, as Publius in the Federalist Papers, famously argued that it would be a mistake to try to govern, quote, as if men were angels. Such concerns and such thinking shaped the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and the ratification debates in the states. It has long been recognized that the Constitution was the product of some very difficult compromises. There were critical divisions along two fault lines in the convention. Such small states, and by small, we're just talking population here, as Delaware, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Jersey, wanted the same equal weight in the new government that they had enjoyed under the Articles of Confederation, where every state had one vote. Such large states as Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia wanted an inequality of votes based on population. It would, of course, favor them. At the same time, the other fault line, some of the slaveholding states demanded protections for slavery, while most of the northeastern states wanted the new government to have more power over foreign commerce. Throughout the convention summer in Philadelphia, the constant danger was that some group of states would decide that it could go it alone, outside of the Union. In fact, the most effective threat for getting one's concerns protected in the new Constitution was simply to threaten to walk out of the convention and walk out of the Union. Such thinking led to what seemed, even at the time, to be regrettable compromises about a range of issues. Madison hated the so-called Great Compromise, the compromise that gave us a House of Representatives where representation is based on population, and a Senate where it is equal based on states. Many Northern delegates hated the Three-Fifths Compromise, which gave slaveholding states, particularly in the South, added influence in federal elections by adding 3/5 of their total slave population to the population when it came to determining how many representatives they got, how many seats they got in the Electoral College, and other things. Almost everyone outside of South Carolina and Georgia opposed the Constitution's language that prevented the government from shutting off the importation of enslaved people from overseas for at least 20 years. Even the New York and New England delegates who had voted for it because they wanted to get the Deep South states to back them on a strong Commerce Clause. But in each of these cases, union was the paramount consideration. Though a slave owner himself, Madison greatly lamented the strengthening of the slave system that the Constitution provided, but he reasoned that, quote, as great as the evil is, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse. We can see the same calculations if we look at the state ratification conventions. In nearly all of the closely contested states, men who had gone on record as opposing the new Constitution for a variety of reasons, some of them very significant, decided in the end to vote for it rather than risk the Union. One of the most significant of these and most prominent was Virginia's Edmund Randolph. Randolph had been a part of the Philadelphia Convention. He had refused to sign the completed document in September 1787. He had then gone back to Virginia and published a long piece justifying his conduct. But when Virginia's ratification convention met the following summer, he emerged as one of the most outspoken defenders of the new Constitution. By the time that Virginia really got its meeting off and running, the necessary ninth state had ratified, meaning that the Constitution was going to take effect for those states who had ratified, regardless of what Virginia decided. Accused of hypocrisy and betrayal by anti-federalists at the convention, Randolph raised what he called, quote, the hard question. Quote, whether Virginia, as contradistinguished from the other states, can exist without the Union, which a lot of the Virginia anti-federalists thought, the biggest state, the most populous state, of course we can exist outside the Union. And Randolph's answer was, she cannot. Virginia's rejection, he believed, quote, must dissolve the Union. But the Union's dissolution would necessarily, in his words, destroy our political happiness. Randolph's Union-based decision helped to rescue the Constitution in the most important state and in one of the tighter convention votes. The Federalists' understanding that shared neighborhood of independent sovereignties was a problem, and that a single union offered the only solution, drove American policymaking and policy for decades. It shaped the division of the original Federalists, the Constitution-supporting Federalists, into opposing political parties in the early 1790s. This included the dispute over the proper interpretation of the Constitution, but both Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians worried that the other side's views and measures put the Union, and as Madison wrote in 1792, quote, what the Union was meant to secure at risk. This thinking also led both Hamilton and Jefferson, despite their differences, to push George Washington to accept a second term as president in 1792 that he very badly did not want. Jefferson assured him, quote, North and South will hang together if they have you to hang on. It also shaped Washington's famous farewell address from 4 years later. We tend to remember Washington's farewell address, if we remember it at all, let's be generous, as a call for isolationism. That's not how he understood it. For him, it was primarily a plea for Americans to cling to their Union for the reasons that had been developed during the 1780s. Union, he explained to the American people, was, quote, a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. Washington's lengthy discussion of Union echoed that in the Federalist Papers, which is not surprising since both Madison and Hamilton had contributed to earlier drafts of the address. One, quote, inestimable value of Union for Americans, according to the president, first president, was, quote, an exemption from those broils and wars between themselves which so frequently afflict neighboring countries not tied together by the same governments. If they could stay in a union, if they could avoid those broils and wars, Americans would, quote, avoid the necessity for those overgrown military establishments, which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to Republican liberty. In foreign affairs, this kind of thinking led Hamilton to seek a rapprochement with Great Britain through the Jay Treaty in 1794. It led Jefferson to seek the purchase of the Gulf Coast east of the Mississippi River in 1803 from France. When Jefferson's negotiators instead purchased the vast expanse of Louisiana west of the Mississippi, this same package of concerns and solutions prompted an immediate effort on Jefferson's part to close the newly acquired Louisiana territory, the vast bulk of it anyway, to American settlement in order to prevent it from becoming an independent nation beyond the Mississippi River. Quote, we have seldom seen neighborhood produce affection among nations, he remarked within weeks of learning of the purchase. The reverse is almost the universal truth. In 1808, when Jefferson's Secretary of Treasury proposed a system of roads and canals that would connect north and south, east and west, he grounded his plan on the assessment that, quote, no other single operation within the power of government can more effectually tend to strengthen and perpetuate that union, which secures external independence, domestic peace, and internal liberty. Same kind of thinking shaped Jefferson's response late in his presidency to mounting British and French pressures on American commerce. It shaped Madison's decision to go to war with Great Britain in 1812. As one correspondent reminded President Madison, quote, this country must have commerce to preserve the Union, considering how many people have their all in ships and the greater proportion of the Eastern people supported by them. In the aftermath of the disastrous War of 1812, the same calculations about neighborhood and union shaped the domestic and foreign policies of Madison and his successor, James Monroe, regarding the Gulf Coast in Florida, internal improvements, and other issues. And this kind of thinking spread beyond the howls of power. This wasn't just something that the Washingtons and Jeffersons and Madisons and Monroes understood. In newspapers, in books, in speeches, and in letters from the late 18th and early 19th century, one can find ordinary Americans explaining the dangers of disunion and the advantages of union in exactly the same terms that were used by the framers of the Constitution. Philadelphia's salonière, Elizabeth Willing Powell, sounded just like Hamilton and Jefferson when she urged her friend George Washington to accept a second term in 1792. If he stepped aside, she warned the president, quote, the anti-federalists would use it as an argument for dissolving the Union. In 1803, William T. Berry, a 19-year-old law student in central Kentucky, sounded just like Jefferson when he warned that Napoleon would try to use his control over New Orleans and the mouth of the Mississippi to foster, quote, disunion between the western and eastern states. Later that year, an anonymous writer in a Connecticut newspaper blasted the Louisiana Purchase based on the same logic, insisting that it would, quote, lay an everlasting foundation for exhausting blood and treasure in America, as they are wasted in Europe by neighboring nations for the destruction of each other. The same understanding was embraced by some of the next generation of policymakers. In 1801, John Quincy Adams echoed Publius, the author of The Federalist, when he explained to his brother that, quote, from the moment of disunion, each American state would become, with regard to the others, a foreign power. Quote, standing armies, intolerable taxes, forced levies, contributions, conscriptions, and requisitions would inevitably follow, destroying Republican government in the states, just as they had prevented the emergence of more liberal governments in Europe. As Secretary of State and then as President between 1817 and 1829, Adams remained one of the most vocal and most significant representatives of the thinking that had shaped the Constitution. He was far from alone. Kentucky's Henry Clay, and at least at his best moments, South Carolina's John C. Calhoun, also embraced the analysis of the Federalists and relied upon it to shape the policies that they advanced in Congress, in Calhoun's case in the War Department, in the late 18-teens and early 1820s. For 40 years after the Constitutional Convention, securing and supporting a more perfect union of the growing number and expanse of states seemed essential to accomplishing the central purposes of the Revolution. The Federalists of the constitutional and ratification debates were very open about their intentions, about their assessments of the threat to the Union in the late 1780s, and about the necessity of a new, more perfect Union for securing the gains of the Revolution. They spelled them out in the preamble to the Constitution, as I noted earlier, and they developed them at length in their speeches and essays. Publius, for example, devoted the first 14 Federalist essays in one way or another to quote the advantages of the Union and the certain evils and the probable dangers to which every state will be exposed from its dissolution. The next 8 essays approach the same subject from a different direction by elaborating upon the problems of the existing Confederation, but pointing toward the probability that it will collapse and the states will divide. Other Federalist speakers and writers were equally clear. Over the next 4 decades, political leaders from George Washington to John Quincy Adams regularly explained the logic of the Union to the American people. These are not the kinds of sources that require creative and rigorous research. They are out there, they were published, they're some of the big documents to come out of these decades. With such clear evidence, we should have no trouble understanding what the framers of the Constitution considered their most important intention, but we do. And truth be told, we, meaning Americans, have for a very long time. By the late 18-teens and early 1820s, many Americans had already begun to consider the framers' reasoning outdated, if not to ignore it entirely. One could point to a number of reasons for this development. I'm going to suggest a couple briefly. First, by the mid-1820s, the Union had survived a series of challenges. It had survived the emergence of sectionally based political parties, a quasi-war with France, the danger of foreign control of the mouth of the Mississippi River, and a full-scale war with Great Britain. To many Americans, the Union, very simply, seemed to have proved itself capable of surmounting any challenge. Second, the Union was also clearly stronger than it had been 40 years earlier, with more citizens, more states, more territory, and more wealth in the Union as a whole. And the West, which had always seemed most prone to set up for itself, had not done so, despite the strains upon the Union of Spain's control of the Mississippi in the 1780s and 90s, of France's reacquisition of Louisiana in 1800, of the Aaron Burr conspiracy in the middle of the 1800s, and of other factors. With the whole of the Mississippi in American hands, and with steamboats easing upriver travel, the bond of East and West seemed secure by the late 18 teens and early 1820s. The great irony, of course, is that it was in the 18 teens and 1820s, as Americans stopped worrying about the Union, that the issue that would ultimately tear apart slavery, and in particular the expansion of slavery into new territories in the West, emerged with new force. But for many, the apparent success of Congress in damping that danger through its compromise over slavery in Missouri suggested, incorrectly of course, that the Union would always overcome the internal threats that it faced. So, does it matter that we have largely forgotten the original intentions of the framers? Well, for all our current problems, and there are plenty of them, I do not think that we need to start worrying about our Union, at least not in the way that they did. And I do not think that their original intents in this regard provide much ground for interpreting most of the issues that are at stake in our own time. That said, as a historian, I am of course obligated to say that it does matter that we have forgotten their concerns and their calculations. Understanding their views about neighborhood and union might provide a useful corrective to a modern belief that if only all the world's powers were capitalist democracies, the world would enjoy peace and prosperity without end. Tom Paine may have believed in the near-utopia of what's called a democratic peace. Some modern political scientists do as well. The framers certainly did not. But I also think that a richer understanding of the past, particularly a past that through the Constitution itself continues to shape our actions so powerfully, is inherently valuable. If nothing else, it reminds us of the incredible distance between our world and theirs, of the vast gap between what they considered entirely unacceptable, permanent armies, heavy taxes, and centralized power, or highly unlikely, the long-term survival of the Union and the Constitution, and what we live with every day. Thank you all. I'm very happy to take questions. Yes?
I kind of have a few. What do you think the founding fathers would think of the modern United States?
What would the founding fathers think of the modern day? Well, there's of course a lot going on, but I think a lot of it they would not be pleased with. A lot of them, in fact, were very disappointed by the time they died. Right? By the 1820s and 1830s, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Monroe, they were already disappointed with how things had developed in ways that they had not expected. They already saw the next generation as having failed to do things that they thought were critical. And this happened for a variety of reasons, and different reasons for different people. But there was a pretty broad sense among the survivors of the sort of elite of that generation that things had not gone in a good direction. They didn't like parties. I mean, this is the first thing that would annoy them about right now, right? They did not believe in political parties. According to Madison and the Federalists, they were factions were the disease most incident to a Republican government, right? He saw them as poisoning Republican governments. And so that was always, that alone would be enough to raise concerns for them about where we are now. Yeah.
Where did they establish the way to come up with amendments to the Constitution?
The amendment process was tricky because when they sent the Constitution off to the states, they said to the state ratifying conventions, they said it's an up-down vote. And 4 or 5 states had already approved, very easily in fact, and it was going to be very tight in Massachusetts. And the thing that Massachusetts did to kind of break a potential deadlock and actually save the Constitution was to say, all right, we're going to listen to them, it has to be up down, we're going to vote to ratify, but we're going to also attach a list of recommended amendments for the first Congress under the new Constitution to take up. And after Massachusetts did that, some of the other states followed that example. Madison didn't like them, right? He didn't really want the Bill of Rights. He thought the Bill of Rights was, in many ways, unnecessary. He thought the danger was that if you write some stuff down, then anything that's not written down doesn't seem to be protected, right? And so he kind of shepherded the process of shrinking all of the amendments that had come in from the ratifying conventions down to, I think there were actually 12 that were put forward, and they were kind of rolled, a couple of them were rolled together, maybe 1 or 2 were left off, into what became the Bill of Rights. But it was certainly not a part of the original plan, and it was sort of a reluctant step to get more, I guess we would now say, buy-in. Right? They probably would hate that too, but that's what it is. Yes.
I also wanted to say the entire quote Democratic piece. I don't think it's realistic to assume that Democratic states wouldn't go to war with each other, because nationalism is one thing that people need to keep in consideration, and that is basically the cost of World War I.
Yeah. Well, World War I's tricky because most of them were autocratic governments, right? They were emperors and czars and all that stuff. Yeah.
Although I would actually kind of argue that Turkey was semi-democratic. I mean, they did have multiple political parties in their government.
Yeah. Well, you're in good company because Hamilton and Madison and others would totally agree with you. That you cannot just rely on the fact that we are popular governments and commercially oriented popular governments to not go to war with each other. And particularly the first 9 Federalist essays, which nobody reads, they all think the exciting stuff starts at number 10, Madison's number 10, which is very interesting. But that's where they really lay all this out. Right? That's where most of the quotes that I took from the Federalists came from 6 and 8 especially, but 6, 7, 8, 1, they say exactly why they're doing what they're doing. It's just we don't read those because they don't tell us about the government. They tell us about why the government was needed. We don't think that matters anymore, right? And people haven't thought about it for a very long time. Yeah. Yes?
So based on this rocky foundation to start, should the Constitution be a living document changed over the 250 years?
Well, it has, and I think it has to have, yes. I mean, I think there's, it probably either needed to change or to be replaced, right? And the amendment process is extraordinarily difficult. So the way to sort of ease that is to take a little bit more latitude in matters of interpretation, or sometimes a lot more latitude in matters of interpretation, which becomes problematic. Yes?
What function does the Federalist Society serve nowadays?
I don't know. I mean, they've put forward a lot of names for judges that have the ideas about original intent that I don't share, but I don't want to go much beyond that. Yes.
Do you think founding fathers want us to think about their original intent with our modern situation?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think Madison said that he didn't think that that was the way to go and that it would be really impossible to figure out. I mean, he understood when he said, if you want to get the original intent, you have to look at the state ratifying conventions. He knew you really couldn't find it there, right? That they aren't all recorded. There's no real evidence there, meat there. And it's going to point in probably not 13 different directions, but a number of different directions. I mean, Virginia's convention lasted weeks. Massachusetts' convention lasted weeks. They decided that they would go through the document paragraph by paragraph and talk about every paragraph of it. Sometimes they jumped ahead and jumped back. So it would be an absolute mess. And then you have to decide, okay, who matters? Does it only matter if it wins? Or do we also have to take account of the people who wanted to make sure that there were guardrails against some of the things that they were worried about? What is the original intent? Who gets to say that that's the original intent? Other questions?
President?
Yes.
It's really slightly different, but you talked about the number of representatives based on the population.
Yes.
How did the states pick their boundaries? Why are some large and some small?
That all came from the colonial charters. The boundaries, that all came from the colonial charters except for the fact, of the original states anyway, except for the fact that some of the states, what came to be called the landed states in the late 70s and early 70s, had claims that actually extended to the Pacific. Georgia, South Carolina had a tiny little ribbon that it went all the way to the Pacific. North Carolina, Virginia, which included not just West Virginia and Kentucky, but all that we think of as the Northwest Territory. Pennsylvania, though it's a big state, was very clearly bounded in the West. Maryland was bounded in the West, but New York had claims, even though it seems to be bounded by the lake, beyond the mountains. And Connecticut, as I said, Connecticut had claims that ran across northern Pennsylvania and into what we think of as the Western Reserve, right, the Connecticut Reserve area in northeastern Ohio, right, Case Western in Cleveland. That whole area was claimed by Connecticut. And in the 1770s, the northern states turned over all of their claims to the general government. The ones, everybody turned over claims north of the Ohio River. But south of the Ohio River, they held on to them for longer. They eventually turned them all over as well there. But the state boundaries are total, it's just based on who was the king then. Some of the New England ones are even messier than that, right? People just broke off from someplace and went up, set up shop for themselves. King liked William Penn, and so he gave him Pennsylvania. King Charles II liked a bunch of cronies who had helped him regain the throne after the English Civil War, so he gave him the Carolinas, and then they were eventually divided into North and South Carolina. So there's no, it's the furthest thing from logic. Now, when it came to figuring out what to do in the West, that was deliberate, right? That was the Confederation government working with an initial report from Thomas Jefferson, which was then modified into the Northwest Ordinance. And the initial report, Jefferson's report, went all the way to the 31st parallel, to the northern border of Florida. The Northwest Ordinance, of course, started only went as far south as the Ohio River. Jefferson had imagined something like 14 states beyond the mountains, so as many states between the mountains and the river as were east of the mountains. But a lot of the people in the Congress, Confederation Congress, didn't like that. They didn't want to lose power that quickly to lots of western states. And so they limited it to, we know it as 5 in the Northwest Territory. They actually said it might be as few as 3 in the Northwest Territory. Right? They wanted to really slow down the process of western settlement and new state formation in the West. Did that answer your question? Yes?
You mentioned the anxiety regarding independence of Western territories as opposed to that. How much do you believe that the Whiskey Rebellion played into those fears?
The Whiskey Rebellion can tap into those fears in some way because they were beyond the mountains. And there were some people involved in the Whiskey Rebellion who had already been involved in things like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. And some of them went back to the regulator movement in North Carolina. So these people were already seen as worrisome. There were some signs that whiskey rebels were maybe reaching out to the British. The British, into the early 1790s, still had forts on the American side of the line because the United States had not lived up to its treaty commitments under the Treaty of Paris. And so there were 8 British forts south of the river, south of the line, including Michilimackinac, on Lake Champlain near Vermont. So it's kind of strung along there. So it wasn't hard for them to establish contact with the British. So it was certainly an issue, but it wasn't the most worrisome of the things going on in the West, which were more what's called Spanish conspiracy in Kentucky, and to some extent, at least a panic degree, the Burr conspiracy, right? Those, and then the biggest thing, which was French control over New Orleans and the mouth of the Mississippi. That seemed like it gave France the ability to pry the West away from the Union. All it had to do was say no trade down the river. And if you want to trade down the river, you have to make deals with us, right? And that was extremely powerful. What you can't really see in this map, but what you have to keep in mind is that for the founding generation, they were tiny, right? They were big compared to Europe, but when you compare them to the continent, they're this one tiny little slice of a vast continent. And when they looked across the mountains, what did they see? They saw a natural empire that was bounded in the east by the Appalachians and in the west by the Rockies, and whose natural capital was New Orleans, because every drop of water that fell in that area went past New Orleans. Every boat could go past New Orleans, right? And so they saw this huge, dangerous thing out to the west, and they were trying to figure out how to keep people from getting in there until they had established enough of a presence and enough loyalty with people that they wouldn't go set up shop for themselves, right? And this is the concerns about Napoleon being there, but it's also very much concerns about Burr being there. What if Burr gets control of New Orleans? Can't he just shut it down and pull the West out of the Union and set up an empire under his own control based around New Orleans, right? Centered around New Orleans. And can we force him out with our tiny little navy and an army that would have to march over the mountains to get there? Well, except for the part that was under Wilkinson's control, which was right there, but Wilkinson was even less reliable than Burr was. I write a book on the Burr conspiracy, so if anybody wants to go plunge more deeply into the Burr conspiracy, it's all out there. Other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much.